What are some of the common safety challenges that arise on those types of projects, early design decisions? I think you wanted to mention also like a past Boeing case. Can you get into that too to help prevent these accidents?
Sure, yeah. Some of it I've already mentioned. I mean, there's a chance all the time really about human error, and it's miscalculations, load and stress. It's choosing improper materials, having a theoretical understanding of construction, poor quality workmanship, the deviations that I already talked about.
When it comes to structural engineering, safety isn't just something you check on site, it begins at the drawing board. In this episode, we're joined by Shawn Galloway, CEO of ProAct Safety, to talk about how leadership across project teams can affect safety and make the difference between structural success and failure. Whether you're an engineer, architect, or someone fascinated by how our built world stays safe, this conversation will show you why effective planning and clear communication saves lives long before construction begins. I'm your co-host, Matt Picardal.
And I'm your co-host, Alex Dev, and this is the Structural Engineering Channel.
Strong leadership drives strong projects. Become an AEC PM professional and give your team the leadership skills they need to thrive. Customized PM development, premium content, and a leadership edge that sets you apart. Learn more at aecpm.com.
Shawn, can you start by telling our listeners a bit about yourself, your career journey, and what led you to become a leader in safety, performance, and culture?
Absolutely. I started my career right after high school. I joined the military, and so I did college afterwards. And my first business job, if you will, after the military was an engineering firm called Offset Services based in England. And I was over there working. Fleur Daniel, now Fleur, recruited me to come back and work for the organization. So I left England, came back to the Houston area, which is where I live, and worked in their Sugarland office. And what I was doing was photogrammetry, maybe something you're familiar with as well, laser scanner mapping, building all those as-built models. And I did that for several years, working inside of a lot of chemical plants, petrochem, a lot of process environments. I started getting heavily involved into OSHA's regulation around what's called process safety management. Anytime you have hazardous chemicals as a part of your operation, there's a whole level of rigor that the federal government requires to keep people in the community safe. And I was doing that for a few years, and I got recruited in 2005 to come to work for ProAct Safety, the company that I now serve as the CEO. The first few years, I was overseeing our consulting arm. We had a software piece of the business at the time. And in 2009, I became the president and the other shareholder in the company. We divested the software. And since then, 2021 became the CEO. But for the last 20 years, and I realized just the other day, we're now in June, that it was 20 years ago in June that I joined ProAct. But we've always kind of focused in 5 areas. One is making sure the organizations have the right systems in place. So that's both on the prevention of unwanted events, but also to have the resiliency, the planning for what happens if things don't go to plan. You have deviations from expectations. So the recovery side, the system capacity, making sure that we have the right leadership capacity. We're making the right decisions when we're putting work out there and putting people in potential for harm's way. You have engagement capacity, and you have cultural capacity. Everybody has a culture. To get a little bit more narrow, everyone has a safety culture on a job. It just may not be the one that you want. So we have to be intentional about what is it that we want. And then finally, the strategic capacity. Just like businesses have a strategy and how they go to market, you have to have a strategy within your organization. How do we get the best out of our people? How do we make sure that we accomplish our objectives? Safety is at the same level as cost and schedule. And because of that work, and it's something that I've become over the last 2 decades really passionate about, that led to us realizing there's not a lot of methodology about how you do the things that I just outlined. So we were commissioned in 2011 to write the first book on the topic, and it was called Steps to Safety Culture Excellence, and it's now taught at many universities around the world. But we had that published through Wiley, and then many other books came over the years. My most recent one was published a few months ago, but it's kind of that old saying, you don't have to be an expert to write a book, but once you write a book, you become an expert on something. So that led to keynotes and a tremendous amount of engagement around this. And now my clients range in your world to the weapons program, to Facebook and manufacturing. And I'm working on the Houston airport construction project right now, um, the big expansion on the terminals there. So I get to be on the ground and working with those folks. So it's something that I've become really passionate about. And I think there's a lot of theory when we look at safety versus how do we get some practical steps that people can really go out and make a difference. And the more I just spoke to what I see in my experiences, the more it became practicable within organizations to do these things. The more others are looking at, well, what else is out there? And it led to conversations like we're having today.
It's quite a journey. You really kind of worked across the board, and it really all industries, or wow. So safety,
All
kinda,
industries.
wow. Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. So when you look at, say, the Houston Airport project, I was actually there a couple months ago. There's a lot going on out there. Where do you even begin? And sorry, entry.
Yeah. So where do you begin on a project like that? I hate to be cliche, but um, you begin with the end in mind, as the late Stephen Covey would say. You know, at the end of this project, what does success look like? We first tried this on a construction project probably about 12 years ago. It was on a wind farm project in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And we looked at it and said, we want to have this to become the model of how we build wind farms within the client organization. So they invested heavily into making that a reality. So we got the GC together, we got the heads of the subcontracting firms that they were using, and we invested the time to get together. It was across 2 days and a workshop, if you will, to start with. At the end of this project, what is success going to look like? Not just no incidents, no injuries, none of that. Everybody wants that. But what is it that we would see with confidence that tells us why? And even the paradigms about how we approach projects like this, because the paradigm of how we've measured success in construction projects largely has been, well, the absence of injuries. And the problem with how we've defined that success is, as we're executing on the construction project, a very dangerous perception can get created based on how we've defined success. And it sounds like if safety means not getting hurt, then anything we do on this project that doesn't get us hurt must be. And it's flawed logic. So even trying to, I call it maturing the safety thinking with leadership. So that's where a lot of it starts, is saying, what do we know to be true, but how can we evolve our thinking? And then using that thinking to then answer the question, what would success look like, not just at the end, but along the way? And then we have to look at how we're approaching the project. And there's always going to be deviations that take place. Mistakes are normal in any complex environment, construction projects being one of them. So what's our oversight? How do we monitor that what we're doing is going to plan, and we can intervene when necessary before the injuries and incidents occur? So like what's happening, not just at this project, but a lot of others, is you have to have mechanisms that say, how well are we aligning people with the expectations? Because we do a better job as humans aligning other humans to results expectations than we do behavioral or performance expectations. So it's getting that alignment, but also having regular check-ins throughout the project, day to day, week to week. Are we doing the things that we're committing to doing? Can we create an environment where people feel it's safe to speak up if things aren't going to plan? And we can learn from those deviations before they become disasters. So a lot of it, again, was beginning with the end in mind, getting clarity on what really does success look like that explains our results, and then making sure we have mechanisms to have those feedback loops throughout.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the construction projects. What are some of the common safety challenges that arise on those types of projects? Early design decisions. I think you wanted to mention also like a past Boeing case. Can you get into that too to help prevent these accidents?
Sure, yeah. So some of it I've already mentioned. I mean, there's a chance it all the time really about human error, and it's miscalculations, load and stress. It's choosing improper materials, having a theoretical understanding of construction, poor quality workmanship, the deviations that I already talked about. You look at, so I wrote a book that was published in 23, and it was called The Bridge to Excellence. And I used the metaphor of building a structure that is a bridge, and there's a lot of components to this, to then say your organization is a bridge. It has to have the compliance pillar. If you think, and the bridge, by the way, looks like the London Bridge. So you have these two pillars. One is compliance, the other is culture. You have to have leadership to span in between this trust. Are we building trust? So I wrote this book, and at the end, I said, you have to not only build this bridge, but there needs to be constant inspection and maintenance of the bridge. Because just like regular bridges, you don't build them and walk away. You constantly have to inspect and maintain them. And you also have to protect them against the unforeseen. So I wrote that book. It was published in early 23. And what happened less than a year later? The Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, right? A tanker hit that, took the bridge out. And it was unfortunate timing because I just made mention of that at the very end of the book, that these things are going to happen. Do you have that capacity to recover? And some bridges do have the capacity to take on that type of impact. This one, unfortunately, didn't. So you have to build in those things like tankers, environmental factors, flood. There's all those things that are unforeseen. And just like you guys talked about in your last podcast about climate change and all of those things. So you have to build in resiliency in your organization and in your projects, obviously. But if you look at like the Boeing case, and they're a great organization, but if you look at historically what happened over time with the merger of the two organizations, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, there were two different prevalent leadership styles. And the one that remained primarily came from the McDonnell Douglas. And they moved as an organization. This is my professional opinion, but they moved, in my opinion, from an organization that was very quality oriented. That there was an old saying in the 80s, and pardon the language here, but if it ain't Boeing, we ain't going. That was kind of the saying about the perceived quality of the platforms that they would create. And knowing the organization inside and out, they're full of wonderful people, great people that are out there at the decision level. However, when they moved the corporate headquarters away from Seattle, they moved the engineers from being away from out on the floor, that monitoring I just talked about, that constant inspecting where deviations might be coming. And then there were rumors of backlash that if you spoke up about safety concerns or quality concerns. So in my opinion, they moved from what I call an organization that had really strong signals, hey, this is working, this isn't working, to an organization with very weak signals. And those things unfortunately resulted and manifested in those two birds that went down, leading to the catastrophic loss of life. So just like in any project, there has to be constant feedback loops in the very beginning and all the way throughout, because there are going to be deviations. And even when you look at safety on the construction side, you have to look at contractor safety, like the question about the Houston project. There's the client, the Houston Airport System. They have two general contractors that they're overseeing that. And then there's a lot of subcontractors that are actually performing the work. So we have to look at the efficacy of our systems and how we're pre-qualifying people, how we onboard them to the expectations, not just of how work is conducted, but how safe work is conducted. All the expectations about job safety analysis and risk assessment inspection. So how are we monitoring the job? How are we even doing a post job at the end, which is a huge opportunity in projects? We tend to mobilize up, get to the project, complete it, demobilize, go on to the next one. So we miss that opportunity for, in the military, we call it an after action review, for really understanding all the lessons learned about that. But whether it's Boeing, whether it's looking at the Francis Scott Key, the old saying, those that don't learn from the past are kind of doomed to repeat it. There's also past failure analysis that can occur. What are all the things that led to the structural integrity of this versus the things that led to failure? And then how do we build further agility and resilience in our projects?
Yeah, it's I know when you mentioned that culture aspect when you were mentioning that Boeing case. Yeah, this is just some rumors of saying, oh yeah, you probably shouldn't speak up. then that can affect that whole chain, that feedback loop. And it reminds me of, I know for structural engineers, even though we're not on site, there is that safety component where we're doing the quality checks, the double checks on the structures themselves, just to make sure that has to be in place too. That culture of, hey, if something's off, you're encouraged to speak about it. You're not going to get punished for it. Speak out about it. And kind of a side tangent too. I noticed you mentioned the military. How much of that experience helped you with this? It seems like there's some lessons that you learned from the military to come up with these methodologies. How much did it inspire that or help you out in your career?
Well, another side tangent. I think every young person should go into the military, at least basic or boot camp, that not necessarily have to serve, but it most certainly teaches you work ethic. It teaches you to stick to it in this. It teaches you that you are a part of a team and you can't be just an individual performer. And that's one of the hard things that a lot of people struggle with is when they come out of the military is adapting back to civilian lifestyle, because you have the camaraderie, you have the expectations. Um, it, I mean, it affects me in a lot of ways that, punctuality is really important to me. So, but also it's having the operational discipline, the conduct of operations, that you have to behave congruent to what the expectations are. And it's not just you that suffers, it's that everybody suffers if things don't go to plan. And like in the military, you train like you fight and you fight like you train. And when we tend to look at projects, construction can do a better job at, failure mode analysis than some of the other operational environments that I work in. But we tend to do a lot more training and education for people about how to make sure the work goes as planned versus what happens if it doesn't. And so I took a lot of those things, and you're right, they definitely affect your mindset. But because that was a long time ago, and now just having the privilege of flying in and working in so many different industries, that certainly did provide a foundation of some of my paradigms and how I think. But I'm constantly evolving how I view things. I mean, I'm sure, just the work that you guys are in, there were practices 10 years ago that were viewed as acceptable that today we view as unacceptable, because our thinking continues to evolve, and all progress begins by thinking differently. So, even back in the military, you are taught that you're supposed to speak up. Now, the joke is that you're supposed to, well, not the joke, but you're supposed to take your rank off when you go into an after action review, that you're talking about a mission, success or failure. But we know that there's still a rank that somebody's wearing. So it's how do we create that environment that it's okay to speak up about things, because, it could lead to loss of life, and trying to take those learnings and then how do we apply it into what we're trying to accomplish with work. But also, if you go back to what happened even in our conflicts in the Middle East the last couple of decades or longer now, but how we used to define winning in the military was conquering the opposing force, destroying their will to fight, and then really moving on. Now it's about community building. It's about building infrastructure. The Corps of Engineers has played a huge role in what happens over in the Middle East when some of the areas have been devastated. So even the doctrine around what defines success in the military had to evolve. And as I saw that happening, that's what led to a lot of the discussions we have with leaders, back to my earlier point about how we've defined success has to evolve. Because the old saying, your organizational systems are perfectly designed to give you the results you're currently receiving. So if we want different results, we have to look at how we're thinking about it, and how we're going about it. So it certainly did play a part.
Yeah, that actually leads into a question I have is how can structural engineers demonstrate effective safety leadership, especially when they're not at the site, leading any of the work? And is there a way for them to engage in different subcultures to get a better handle on how to strengthen things safety-wise?
Great question. I have a lot of projects where we have to get the project engineers and the project managers out of the job trailer or out of the project management office to out there to look at work as it's actually being performed. And every time we do this, there's always epiphanies that occur, even with the ground conditions in a muddy environment, for example, and how frustrating that is and how it affects the ability to stay on target. So the first way I would answer that is be intentional about a culture that promotes safety over cost and schedule. Now we're all held accountable to that. I'm a realist. I understand that, but I'll paraphrase what Steve Jobs said. What fascinates my boss interests the heck out of me. So people pay attention to what the bosses are paying attention to. And when we have conversations with our contractors about the project, and if we mention safety one time and the 100 times we mention schedule and cost, well, what just got inferred? It got inferred that the intention is that's the most important thing. And that certainly may not be the intention of what gets communicated, but people are paying attention to what leadership's paying attention to. So we need to be intentional about what is it we're trying to create, and then what are our responsibilities as engineers, as construction managers, project managers? What are our responsibilities to make that happen? It's kind of like the oxygen mask principle. You got to put yours on first before helping other people. So getting clarity then around what I call safety RRRs, roles, responsibilities, and results. So what's a PE's role in this? Then the responsibilities need to be behaviorally defined. And then what's the outcome? What's the result that we want? But all of this is theoretical until we get people out of the office to be there where work can be occurring. And I get it, that's not always easy, but otherwise, what I often see as a byproduct is the construction personnel have, or the project management personnel have a theoretical understanding of construction, and I'll then see the construction people have a theoretical understanding of engineering and project management. And then that disconnect leads to failures and deviations throughout the project. So getting people aligned in the beginning, and this goes to the CEO, this goes to senior executives and leadership. You have to invest in that type of monitoring. You have to free people up to do a little bit of management by wandering around on the project to look at the decisions that are being made and how are they being carried out in the field, because a deviation can, again, happen all the time. So it's establishing those safety RRRs. It's engaging in continuous learning about other events. It's even increasing the safety technical acumen of project personnel and engineers, making sure they understand the regulations, making sure we're continuously enhancing how they think about things. But also, even though it's a little bit slower to involve others in some of the decisions that are being made, the more we can involve people that are at the sharp end of the stick, as we call in human and organizational performance, versus the decisions being made at the blunt end of the stick, the more ownership we're going to have in the work as it's being carried out. One of the individuals that was responsible for the big quality movement here in the United States around the 80s was Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And one of Deming's principles really served me well. It was introduced to me by my business partner, Terry Mathels. People support what they help to create. And it's easier to make these decisions. Here are the plans, go forward and execute. But the more we're involving people so they have a greater sense of ownership, the more that we're going to have better outcomes on the project.
Ben, I mean, with that much or that many people involved, I love kind of going back to what you said earlier. I like the continuous feedback. Communication is key. But what you just added of getting people involved with how this is all going to work early on, so they're part of the planning, I think that's probably the trick. It's highly effective. You are way more invested the second you participate in making the plan. You want to make sure it's carried out through fruition. So I appreciated that a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, Alex, I'll even add that, as we communicate plans, as we communicate even changes to plan, we have to realize that we're dealing with an emotional species, not a logical species when we're talking to other humans. And humans respond emotionally before they respond intellectually or logically when it comes to changes or briefings and communication. But research shows there are three things that trigger somebody to resist some sort of direction or change. Number one, they don't understand it. So we don't do a good job communicating the rationale, the why, what led to this. Number two, they don't like it. And number three, they don't like who's bringing it. That last one has to do with trust. So that's why, again, creating an inclusive environment where we're talking about this, people can grow to trust the decisions as they're being made. But if they don't understand it and if they don't like it, that results in unnecessary resistance. I would rather an environment, if I had to, where they don't like it, but they get it. And I like what the plan was, but I understand why we have to do it. At least we get some grudging compliance there versus just here's where we're going and we're not giving you the why. You're on a need to know basis, back to that military example.
Yeah, giving them the why in terms of why are we doing this? I don't like it, but I get it. It's better than just why are we doing this? This is pointless. So at least to get the why.
Precisely.
You mentioned shared ownership. What about on complex projects with diverse teams and hundreds of people? What does shared ownership of safety look like in those?
Yeah, this is in a book that I just had published, and it's called Shared Ownership: Engaging the Subculture. So if you want to know how many subcultures you have the potential for on a project, it's how many first line supervisors you have, how many foremen, how many is that first base of leadership of all the contract firms that are out there. That's where you have the potential for these subcultures to form. And that's not necessarily bad unless it's misaligned with the overall culture that we're trying to create on a job site. So again, trying to be as practical as possible. The companies that invest in getting that voice of the customer perspective from those individual contractors are going to get a lot more from those individual contractors. So what we're talking about here is engagement, and employee engagement, whether it's for a contractor or a project engineer. Engagement in an objective like safety begins with getting somebody interested in what we're doing. Then it evolves to where they buy into what we're doing. And people won't buy in until they had the opportunity to weigh in, to feel as though they've been heard about what the concerns are or why this decision was made. Then you get willing participation. So we want you to do a pre-job task assessment before doing this. We want you to have this within 50 feet of where work's being conducted. They've got to buy into why that's important versus just as a directive from the GC or from the client. So then you get some willing participation, and then you get to the step of self-ownership. So for example, for this, Alex, Matt, how often do you wash a rental car?
Maybe
once. What about detailing a rental car?
Pretty limited.
Never.
Right. Why? It's not yours.
Not mine.
It's not yours. You'll do the minimal necessary, refuel it, turn it back in, get on your flight and go home. You'll do the minimal necessary because it's not yours. So back to my earlier point, people have to have a sense of ownership. This is mine. And if you think about how you take care of something that you're paying for, it's yours, you have a vested interest in, you're going to take care of that a lot differently than if this is XYZ company's safety program. So you got to get people involved in what some of these decisions are. And this goes back to a lot, like you mentioned, a lot of different contractors on the job site. But if you can identify, where possible, who some of those influential people are, because that's who sets the tone for the individual culture, is whoever has the loudest voice. That shapes the storytelling, that shapes the perspectives, and culture is beliefs that govern behavior, that common beliefs and common behavior. So all of those cultures could be a little bit different. So if we can get a voice, even if it's from leadership, to agree on what we're trying to accomplish, not just no injuries and incidents, but why we're trying to accomplish, how it's our license to operate, how it's necessary for business. I mean, look at the disastrous Macondo incident that happened in the Gulf of Mexico from, BP and Transocean. They spent more, from what I understand, in billions in marketing campaign than they ever did in actually cleaning up the Gulf of Mexico, because their brand, unfortunately, was so tarnished. So it affects the continuity of the business, but it can also become a competitive advantage. I've seen construction firms that go way above and beyond and do some impressive things, so much that their client extends them additional projects. So it becomes a competitive advantage for the organization. So they have to be able to answer that. You've heard the famous radio station, WIIFM. maybe that dates me because who really listens to FM radio anymore? It's all Sirius satellite radio. But the what's in it for me question, if we're not answering that,
Yeah.
you're not going to get that ownership. And shared ownership, I find, was the final piece to where we're all in this together. In the Army, it was your battle buddy that, Alex, Matt, I know that you're struggling today. I'm going to physically carry you to the other side of this line because I know you've got my back if I'm in a similar situation. So I step in where necessary to help us get to the other line of those objectives. That never occurs until we're paying attention to, okay, we've got this objective that we want this project to be world class. Are people interested in why this is important? Do they buy into what our plan is? Have they had a voice in that plan? Do they have a sense of ownership in it? And what can we do to where we're on one team on this project? So that means we need to invest in communication. As one stage of the project shows up here, we're doing pile driving, and then the next is we got concrete coming in. How are those contract firms talking to one another? How are they involved in the planning of this versus all of these individual silos that take place? So it's a hard task to invest in that, but those that are intentional about the performance they want as the project's being executed are the ones that tend to outperform, outmaneuver, uh, win projects, and are the ones that are kind of seen as the shining examples, because all it takes is one fatality to make the news and a couple of fatalities, and you lose your right to even bid on projects as a contractor.
Yeah, I think that ownership is a huge one in terms of engagement, even just in general practice. You give someone a small task, let's just say an engineering task from my experience, they'll do it. But then if you give them a big chunk of the project and say, this is yours, there's usually some type of ownership shift where it's like, oh, this is mine. I'm going to double, triple check everything because this part of the project is mine, versus you just get a handoff and just a small task that you don't really have ownership of. Yeah, I think it's a huge part of engagement. And yeah, it seems to same thing with safety. Letting the owners or the shareholders or the important people having a piece of having the say, having a word in it. It's not just they're being told what to do, they're helping create it.
Absolutely right. Back to that people support what they help to create principle.
Man, that makes sense. And just imagining the projects that I've worked through, engineering, construction, whatever you want to call it, in our field of work, there's a lot of people coming in and out of the project. If you're looking at the full project life cycle and you want to foster that safety mentality or leadership, how do you accomplish that from execution all the way out to closeout? Because I'm sure you're aware of, subcontractors, they bid, they get the contract, sometimes they get fired off the job. And even in design, we had those types of issues very early on. You could have different teams swapping out. Somebody goes on vacation, so maybe they don't have that ownership. So I guess I'm wandering a little bit to the real question is, how do you actually do that from start to finish on a project, and what does that look like?
Well, it starts with the DNA of the general contractor or the client organization, and all of that's going to cascade from there. It's kind of the old saying, get your own house in order first. So if you want to affect the work of other people, people are paying attention to how the client organization conducts themselves, how the project management firm conducts themselves. So it starts with being intentional about what we're trying to accomplish here. And then you have to build in, even in the tendering process, if we want excellence to be our reality. But let me back up for a second. An honest conversation needs to occur at the board level, at the executive level. What is our objective? Is our objective truly to be world class, or is our objective to incrementally improve safety performance year after year? Both are noble quests, as long as we're not trying to remain static, because there is no stasis in safety. You're either getting better or you're getting worse. But it first starts with answering that question: what's our intention? What are we trying to accomplish? Because, as I'm sure we can all agree, if world class in any area is the objective, that takes a completely different resource allocation than if we just want incremental improvement. So it starts there with answering what are we trying to accomplish, and then how we bring work to plan, to execution, to handover at the end. What are we doing to enable that being our reality? including how we're choosing our vendors, how we're choosing our contractors, to how we recognize their performance, the touch points along the way, getting robust in looking at my 5 major phases of contractor safety to see, if we're not the ones performing the work, we have to, back to my earlier point about, we have to mature our own thinking within the own organization before we expect excellence from our contractors. And I see this very often, that sometimes it's the contract firms themselves that are much better at safety than the clients that are hiring them. And then you have some misalignment in how work is conducted. But I would answer, you have to build that in the beginning, but you also have to be open within the scope that, again, things aren't going to go to plan. How do we build those contingencies in? How do we build in the steps to onboard people to those expectations? Because if we're just bringing in a new technical resource on this job and then throwing them out to the job, or throwing them on the job, without helping them become aware with what we're trying to accomplish, then, a lot of people going in a lot of well-intended direction that ends up with a mess on some of these projects. So investing in the beginning in strong and clear and concise communication. I guess in summary, what I'll say is, I learned a long time ago, projects don't fail in the end, they fail in the beginning, and usually because of misaligned expectations.
And you mentioned investing and that you're also a realist. So for the stakeholders that are investing money into these projects and with the tight budgets, how do you convince them to get on board? What's your approach to get them on board and to invest in safety and not just having the tightest budget?
Rarely nowadays do I see an organization that doesn't really that really lacks the care about safety on a job site. Now I work all over the world, so let me say, in the developed world, rarely do I find an organization where safety is not important. But it goes back to, if we're unsuccessful in safety, if we're not managing something as important as safety of our employees as contractors well, what else aren't we doing well? Safety is an indicator of leadership's capabilities. And if they're not investing in that, and that starts with the board, that starts with the executives. For example, there was a hospital system that, when you look at their safety performance compared to where a CEO from one of the oil and gas companies' safety performance came from, it was way out there. So the oil and gas executive that became a new board member of this hospital system was used to seeing, I'm going to speak safety technical here, but like a 0.0 something incident rate. And that's maybe meaningless to a lot of people, but that's pretty darn good. And this hospital system had a 4 point something. So the delta was massive between what he's used to seeing. He comes in as a board member and was appalled by what was happening. So that change in leadership just created a whole new intensive focus within the organization. So sometimes it does take a change in leadership. Sometimes it takes a change in the environment and the business climate. But to me, it's an indicator of leadership capability, and helping them to realize that, but also realize, being a realist, anytime that I see, whether it's in a project, in manufacturing, in aerospace, any of the industries where I see pretty poor safety performance, I also see it in cost, I see it in schedule, I see it in quality, because it's just a symptom of how effective and how healthy the organization is. If they're doing everything successful in execution of work, then we should expect to see excellent safety performance, meeting costs, meeting timeline, etc. So we have to view this is how we accomplish the tasks within the organization. And if we're going to be okay with safety performance sliding, what else are we going to be okay with? So it's back to setting those realistic expectations. And sometimes, I hate to say this, and I never want this to occur, but whenever there is a tragic event, it almost always becomes a defining moment within the organization. So in the oil and gas industry, they use that term, a burning platform. That you don't want a burning platform necessary for change. So you have to kind of create those in advance of, okay, if we have a fatality, if we have a collapse, what is that going to do to our business? How would we even recover from that? So that can't be acceptable. How are we going to manage this going forward? But it all starts with the top of the organization and them becoming uncomfortable with the current level of performance. And that just cascades throughout the organization. If this only exists within the clay layer, within middle management or frontline, this desire and need to be better, it's never going to truly change who has the ability to allocate resources and budget and everything else. Culture change always happens best from within, but it comes from the direction a tone set at the top of the organization. So I would encourage leaders to look at what other people are doing, look at what leads to successful projects. But anytime a leader's responsible for results, but anytime they reward results, they're reinforcing the performance that led to the results. And that could be good performance, it could be poor performance. So leaders need to become aware of the edicts that they're sending, the direction that they're sending throughout the organization, but need to become more aware of how are those decisions being carried out. Because if you're not intentional as a leader about the culture that you're creating, you are going to be managed by people's perceptions, how the work's carried out, and results are just a byproduct of all of that.
Yeah, starting from the top where you were saying earlier, people are going to care about what the leaders care about, and they don't, like in that example, they didn't start caring about it until one of them was just appalled by it. And yeah, I think that's a good point too, in terms of if you can't even get the basic safety right, what else is there? Yeah, you're going to let that slide if it's like human light. Like if you're letting that slide, then yeah, what else? So what other corners would you be able to cut if your standards are that low? Yeah, I think that's a good indicator of just getting the basic things right in terms of yeah, if you're not getting the basic performance right of safety, you have a bigger issue in the company or the team.
Most definitely.
Well, one of the things you said pretty shortly ago about it can't start in the clay layers or the front lines, it needs to be coming down from leadership. I know a lot of our audience is actually in that younger, probably in the frontline clay layer type category. So a question that pops up for me is, what can somebody in that clay layer frontline level at an organization do to try to encourage their leadership to focus a little bit more on safety, allocate resources? Because I think you kind of hit the nail on top of the head there when you said we can, out of the field, we can care a lot about safety, but if there's no resources or time allotted to actually train or do something differently, change something, there's not much we can do about it. So yeah, I'm very curious about that.
I think it starts with you got to lead yourself first, and you have to understand your severe control and sphere of influence. And the only thing you can control are your own actions, your own behaviors, even your own response to emotional triggers. That's the only thing that you really have control over. You don't have control over anybody else, but you can also start influencing. And you can influence just by continuously improving your own leadership acumen. And a leader, when I say leader, I don't mean the formal title. I mean, you two gentlemen are leaders in this space because you created an influencing voice that you're influencing others. That's leadership. And that's really all it is about influence. So looking at this, regardless of where you sit in the organization, start asking questions. Now, be sensitive about the questions that you're asking, but start asking questions to really understand the organization, kind of the Socratic method, if you will. Ask questions versus just trying to give advice and give feedback on things, but improve how you look at it as well. There are, I mean, with social media, with podcasts like this, there is an increased amount of information that's available. So one of the challenges, if you're coming into any profession, is trying to cut through the noise and finding influential podcasts like this that have really great content. So seek out, benchmark, assess what other people are doing, and then share your thoughts. Maybe where practical, maybe contribute to an article, contribute to a news company newsletter, ask to give a talk about some of these things, or speak up or hold a safety meeting on these topics. Try to bring up these issues or concerns that you have, or identify first what those mechanisms are to voice those concerns that you have. But be as influential as you can, and knowing that you're not going to be making these decisions, but can you find a way to connect with what's important to the leaders so you can relate to them? And a lot of this just goes into relationship building. And with the people that you report to, spend some time to get to understand who they are as individuals. Because once you can establish some rapport with the individual that you directly report to, the easier it is it'll be for you to have these kind of conversations about things that might concern you. So invest in the relationship building, get to know, uh, the preferred name even of the people that you report to, get to know what their interests and hobbies are, get to know what interests them about the profession that they're in. But also the more difficult thing it is for a lot of us to do is to get to know who's important to the individuals. Because once you start connecting with people at an individual, at kind of a relationship level, it makes these harder conversations so much easier to have. But pay attention to this podcast. Seek what other people are doing. And very few organizations are like what used to exist in the 50s and 60s, where companies would professionally develop you and then were intentional about that. Now it's kind of up to a lot of us professionals to look for those opportunities to develop thyself. So that's what I would encourage is just be a sponge, see what else is going out there. And as you see those better practice opportunities, look for the appropriate mechanism to share them within your own organization.
Sounds like more education and communication to me. But
Indeed.
always goes back to that feedback cycle. I like it.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Shawn, for talking about safety. And I think what I got a lot from this podcast too was just the leadership lessons that you instilled with safety. You kind of go hand in hand. So definitely appreciate you coming on and talking about that.
Gentlemen, thanks for having me on. I've enjoyed the conversation.
I hope you enjoyed the episode today. We'd love to hear your feedback, comments, and or questions. To leave them, please visit structuralengineeringchannel.com. There you'll find a summary of the key points discussed in today's episode, as well as links to any of the resources or websites mentioned in this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, we wish you the best in all of your structural engineering endeavors.